What if your wife wasn't just cheating, but using your work in her schemes? One phone call turned my world upside down. The betrayal was deeper than I could have imagined. Stay tuned, this story is about to take an unexpected turn. My hands moved smoothly over the molten glass, guiding it into gentle curves and spirals. The heat from the furnace pressed against my face, but I stayed focused, completely absorbed in my work. This was my safe space, my own studio where I found peace. But as I shaped beauty from the chaos in front of me, a strange uneasiness began to creep in, breaking my concentration. Something was off. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, an old instinct kicking in, warning me. I could faintly hear Caroline's voice in the next room, talking quietly on the phone, another one of her frequent calls. She always said they were about work, important clients who couldn't wait. I frowned as I finished the last touches on my latest piece. I couldn't put my finger on it, but Caroline had been acting differently lately. More secretive. More distant. Setting down my tools, I moved closer to the slightly open door, trying to catch what she was saying. "I can't wait to see you again, Mark," Caroline whispered, her voice low and intimate. "Yes, I know we have to be careful. Kyle doesn't suspect a thing." I froze. My blood ran cold. Mark? Who the hell was Mark? And why was Caroline talking to him like that? No, this couldn't be happening. Caroline wouldn't. But as much as I wanted to ignore it, a sick feeling in my gut told me otherwise. Deep down, I already knew. Moving quietly, I grabbed the tablet we shared, my hands shaking as I unlocked it. A quick scan of her messages confirmed my worst nightmare. There it was in black and white, flirty exchanges, declarations of love, plans for secret meetings. My wife was having an affair. I set the tablet down carefully, my mind spinning. I wanted to rush in, confront her, yell, and demand answers, but something stopped me. I needed more proof. I had to be sure. Mechanically, I went to retrieve the hidden camera I used for security. Within minutes, I had it set up discreetly in the corner of the studio, pointed directly at Caroline's favorite spot where she always took her calls. Now, all I could do was wait. The next few days were absolute hell. I went through the motions, pretending everything was normal, while inside, I was boiling with anger and betrayal. I threw myself into my work, pouring my emotions into the glass, creating pieces that were more intricate and delicate than ever. Finally, my patience paid off. The camera caught one of Caroline's video calls, clear as day. My fists clenched as I watched her playful smiles, her flirty gestures, all for some stranger on the other end of the screen. But what she said next hit me like a punch to the gut. "I've got Kyle working on that new series you commissioned," Caroline said, sounding casual. "Of course, he has no idea you're the buyer. God, Mark, you're brilliant. Using my husband's skills to boost the value of your collection. That's just evil genius." Mark laughed. "Well, I do have expensive taste, both in art and women." I'd heard enough. I shut off the feed, my mind spinning. Not only was Caroline cheating on me, but she and her lover were using my talent to further their own twisted agenda. I needed to know more about this guy. A quick search brought up his name, Mark Callahan, a big shot in the art world, known for his cutthroat reputation. I sneered. Of course, Caroline would be drawn to a guy like that. She'd always had a thing for power and money. I was so lost in my thoughts, I barely noticed when Caroline walked back into the studio. She breezed in like nothing was wrong, all smiles and that fake cheerfulness she'd mastered. "How's the new piece coming along, honey?" she asked, glancing over at my latest work. I had to fight to keep my tone steady. "It's coming along just fine." Caroline's smile wavered for a moment, clearly sensing the tension hanging between us. "Is everything okay?" For a second, I considered confronting her right then, throwing all the evidence in her face. But no, it wasn't the right moment. Just feeling the pressure from deadlines, I lied smoothly. Nothing to worry about. She visibly relaxed, relieved. Well, don't push yourself too hard. I'm off to meet a potential client. My jaw clenched as I forced a smile. I knew exactly where she was going, but I played along. Have a good time. The second she left, the calm mask I'd been wearing crumbled. I started pacing the studio like a trapped animal, my thoughts racing. How could I have been so blind? One thing was for sure, I wasn't going to let this go on any longer. Caroline and her lover thought they could just walk all over me, using my talent and making a fool out of me in the process. But they were about to find out how wrong they were. I grabbed my phone, quickly typing out a message to my old buddy, Sam. If anyone could dig up dirt on Mark Callahan, it was Sam. As soon as I hit send, a slow grin spread across my face. Let Caroline and Mark enjoy their little game for now. Soon enough, they'd realize exactly who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, Caroline's heart was pounding as she drove to meet Mark at a fancy hotel. The thrill of their secret affair still sent shivers down her spine, even after months of sneaking around. She knew how wrong it all was, knew how much it would destroy me if I ever found out, but she couldn't stop herself. Mark made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. When she pulled up and headed inside, a tiny voice in her mind whispered doubts. I had seemed distant lately, maybe even suspicious, but she pushed that thought aside. I was too honest for my own good. I'd never invade her privacy. Sure, our marriage had lost some of its spark, but my loyalty had never wavered. That thought brought a flicker of guilt, but the moment she saw Mark waiting for her in the lobby, looking sharp in his tailored suit, all those doubts vanished. There's my girl, he said with that signature grin, pulling her into a deep kiss. Caroline melted into his arms, any thoughts of me fading away. This felt right to her, being with a man who truly appreciated her. As they made their way to the room, Mark filled her in on his latest plans. That series your husband's working on. It's going to make us rich, he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. I've already got buyers lined up. Once people find out Kyle Buford created these pieces for my collection, the prices will skyrocket. Caroline frowned slightly. You don't think Kyle will start getting suspicious? He might wonder who this mystery buyer is. Mark waved off her concern. Your husband's an artist, not a businessman. He doesn't understand how this world works. As long as he's getting paid, he'll be satisfied. She nodded, though a small hint of unease lingered. Mark was right. I'd never been interested in the cutthroat world of high-end art sales. It was one of the reasons she'd fallen so hard for Mark's charm. Still, as Mark pulled her onto the bed, a flicker of doubt remained. Could she really betray me so completely, using my trust and talent for their gain? But as soon as Mark's lips found hers and his hands started roaming over her body, all those doubts disappeared. She gave in to the passion, determined to savor every stolen moment as long as she could. Meanwhile, I sat at my desk, staring grimly at the stack of papers in front of me. The results of Sam's investigation into Mark Callahan painted an ugly picture: multiple affairs with artists' wives, manipulating the art world through insider deals and inflated prices, and possibly even fraud and money laundering. Caroline had gotten herself mixed up with a real piece of work. A part of me wanted to storm in and confront her, shake her, and demand how she could be so blind. But the cooler, more calculating side of my mind stopped me. I needed undeniable proof, something that would leave her with no excuses, and more importantly, something that would bring Mark Callahan's empire crashing down. Slowly, a plan began to form in my mind. It was risky, probably dangerous, but I was past the point of caution. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number I'd memorized. Sam, it's me. I need one more favor. Mark Callahan stood in his private gallery, looking pleased with himself. Row after row of priceless artwork filled the space, each piece carefully acquired and curated to maximize its value. Soon, he'd have an entire series of Kyle Buford originals added to his collection. The thought brought a smug grin to his face. Poor, clueless Kyle had no idea he was creating the very pieces that would elevate Mark to the pinnacle of the art world. A soft beep from his security system signaled an unexpected guest. Mark frowned, he wasn't expecting anyone. He pulled up the camera feed on his tablet, his eyebrows lifting slightly when he saw who it was. Well, he muttered, a predatory glint in his eyes. Looked like the lamb had wandered right into the lion's den. He buzzed me in, already relishing the confrontation. My fists were clenched tight as I walked into Mark's extravagant gallery. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to rip into this smug bastard, to make him pay for what he'd done, but I forced myself to stay calm. First, I needed answers. Mark was lounging casually against a marble pedestal, a faint, cocky smile on his face. Kyle Buford, in the flesh. What brings you here? I felt my jaw tighten. Cut the crap, Callahan. I know all about you, Caroline, and your little scheme to manipulate my work. For a second, I saw surprise flicker in Mark's eyes, but it quickly faded into a cold smirk. Well, the artist shows some backbone after all. Tell me, Kyle, how does it feel to know you've been nothing more than a pawn in our little game? Rage surged through me, threatening to take over, but I managed to hold it back. Why? I growled. Why go through all this trouble? You've already got more money than you could ever spend. What more do you want? Mark laughed, the sound cold and mocking. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about money. It's about power. Control. Making sanctimonious fools like you dance to my tune without even realizing it. He swept his arm around, motioning to the artwork surrounding us. Every piece in this gallery represents a conquest, a life manipulated, a reputation ruined. And now, thanks to your darling wife, I'll have a series of Kyle Buford originals, made at my command, without you even knowing it. It's beautiful, really. My vision went red. Before I could think, my hands were gripping his collar, slamming him hard against the wall. You arrogant, I started, but Mark just laughed, completely unfazed. Careful now, Kyle. You don't want to do anything reckless. I've got powerful connections. It'd be a shame if your career hit a sudden dead end. I let go of him, stepping back. Was that a threat? Mark straightened his jacket, that irritating smirk still on his face. Think of it more as a friendly heads-up. You're playing with the big boys now, Kyle. The rules are different here. But hey, we could come to an agreement. You keep producing those beautiful pieces for me, and I'll make you ridiculously wealthy. We could even work out a little arrangement for sharing Caroline's company. What do you say? I didn't respond for a long moment. Then, with deliberate calm, I picked up one of the fragile glass sculptures resting on a pedestal nearby. You know, I said casually, the thing about glass is how delicate it is. One wrong move. I let the sculpture slip from my hand, watching with satisfaction as it shattered on the marble floor. Oops. Mark's face twisted in anger. You fool. Do you even realize how much that piece was worth? I met his furious gaze calmly. Not nearly as much as your reputation will be worth when I'm through with you. With that, I turned and walked out of the gallery, leaving Mark sputtering behind me. As I made my way down the long driveway, I caught sight of movement in one of the upstairs windows, a woman's face peering out, watching everything unfold, her expression unreadable. Mark's wife. I mentally filed that away, it might come in handy later. For now, I had plans to set in motion. The final act of this twisted play was about to begin, and I intended to be the one to write the ending. Caroline's phone buzzed relentlessly, jolting her from a restless sleep. She fumbled around in the dark, squinting at the screen. It was 2:37 a.m., and an unknown number flashed across the display. Half asleep, Caroline answered. Hello. Is this Caroline Buford? The voice on the other end was tense, official sounding. Yes. Who's calling? This is Officer Ruiz with the Metropolitan Police Department. I'm calling about Mark Callahan. There's been an incident. He's at St. Mary's Hospital, and it's serious. You were listed as his emergency contact. A chill spread through her body. What happened? Is he? I'm afraid I can't go into detail over the phone, ma'am. You need to come to the hospital as soon as possible. The line cut off abruptly, leaving Caroline frozen in place for a moment. Then, with her heart pounding, she threw on her clothes in a rush. I stirred beside her, blinking awake. What's going on? She paused briefly. Work emergency, she lied easily. Go back to sleep. I'll explain later. As she sped through the empty streets, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. What had happened? And why on earth was she listed as Mark's emergency contact? Had that idiot blown their cover? The emergency room was busy when she arrived, her heart racing as she approached the front desk. I'm here for Mark Callahan. I got a call. The nurse's expression turned serious. Are you family? I'm a close friend. Please, what happened? Before the nurse could reply, a tall woman in a sharp suit stepped forward. Mrs. Buford, I'm Detective Gray. Can we speak in private? Caroline's stomach lurched. A detective? This wasn't good. She followed Detective Gray to a quieter spot, her mind racing. She would need to be very careful from here on out. Mrs. Buford, I understand you were close to Mr. Callahan. Caroline swallowed hard. We were colleagues. He commissioned several pieces from my husband's studio. What's happened to Mark? Detective Gray's gaze was sharp. I'm afraid Mr. Callahan has passed away. He was found in his home studio about an hour ago, and there are some suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. Caroline's world tilted, and she had to grab the wall for support. Dead? But, how? That's what we're trying to figure out. When was the last time you saw or spoke to Mr. Callahan? Her mind raced. She needed to tread carefully here. I'm not sure. Maybe a few days ago, at a gallery event. Detective Gray's eyes narrowed slightly. I see. And your husband? When was the last time he had contact with Mr. Callahan? A cold shiver crawled up Caroline's spine. I'm not certain, she said slowly. Kyle handles the creative work. I'm more involved with the business side of things. Why are you asking? The detective's expression remained unreadable. Just trying to establish a timeline, Mrs. Buford. We'll need to speak with your husband as well. In the meantime, is there anything you can tell us about Mr. Callahan? Any enemies? Anyone who might have had a reason to harm him? Caroline hesitated. This was her chance to distance herself from the whole mess. And if suspicion shifted toward Kyle? He had been acting strange lately. Who knew what he might have done, driven by jealousy? I'm not sure if this is relevant, she began cautiously, but Kyle and Mark had a bit of a disagreement recently about some commission pieces. Things got pretty heated. Detective Gray leaned in a little. Go on. Kyle felt that Mark was being too demanding, rushing the creative process. And Mark, well, he could be pretty aggressive when he wanted something. I never imagined it would go this far, though. Surely Kyle wouldn't. She let the implication hang in the air. The detective nodded. Thank you, Mrs. Buford. We'll be in touch. Please don't leave town. As Detective Gray walked away, Caroline slumped against the wall. What had she just done? But no, this was necessary. She had to protect herself. Kyle would understand. He'd forgive her, eventually, wouldn't he? Kyle was jolted awake by a loud knock at the front door. Groggy and irritated, he stumbled downstairs, noticing Caroline still wasn't home, a wave of anger and resignation washing over him. He opened the door to find two stern-looking police officers standing there. Kyle Buford. Yeah, that's me. I'm Detective Gray. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions about Mark Callahan. A knot formed in Kyle's stomach. What's this about? Mr. Callahan was found dead at his home earlier this evening. We're investigating the circumstances. Dead? Kyle's head spun. Mark was dead. We're just trying to get some answers, Mr. Buford. Will you come with us voluntarily, or should we make this official? His lawyer's advice echoed in his mind: never talk to the police without representation. But if he refused, it might look like he had something to hide, though he couldn't even imagine what. But it was clear they already suspected him. Give me a minute to get dressed, he finally said. I'll go with you. The drive to the station was tense and silent. Kyle's mind was racing. Mark was dead, probably murdered, and the cops thought he was involved. Ridiculous. Sure, he'd confronted Mark, even broken the sculpture, but murder? He wasn't capable of something like that, was he? At the station, they led him into a small, windowless room. Detective Gray sat across from him, her face unreadable. Mr. Buford, can you tell me about your relationship with Mark Callahan? Kyle chose his words carefully. He was a client. He commissioned some pieces from my studio. That's all. Just a client. Nothing more personal than that. Kyle's eyes narrowed. What are you getting at? We have reason to believe your relationship with Mr. Callahan was more complicated. Witnesses saw you at his house earlier tonight, involved in a heated argument. Want to explain that? He should have known there'd be cameras. Stupid, stupid, stupid. I'd like to speak to my lawyer, Kyle said firmly. Detective Gray leaned back, a faint smile playing on her lips. Of course. But I should warn you, Mr. Buford, we have physical evidence placing you at the scene. We have witnesses who saw your argument. And we have a statement from your wife about your temper when it came to Mr. Callahan. Kyle's blood ran cold. Caroline had spoken to them. What had she told them? I'm not saying another word without my lawyer, he repeated. Detective Gray nodded. As you wish. Kyle Buford, you're under arrest for the murder of Mark Callahan. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read him his rights, Kyle's mind spun in a blur of confusion and disbelief. Carter couldn't believe what was happening. He knew Kyle was innocent, but with the evidence stacked against him and Caroline's betrayal, he had a sinking feeling that things were about to get much worse. Rubbing his tired eyes, he stared at the computer screen in frustration. He had been at this for hours, methodically digging through every piece of information he could find about Mark Callahan and the circumstances surrounding his death. A ping from an incoming message snapped him out of his thoughts. It was from Kyle, sent through the secure channel they had set up. Carter, I need your help. I've been arrested for Mark's murder. I swear I didn't do it, but the evidence looks bad. Can you dig deeper, especially into Caroline's whereabouts that night and Mark's wife, Olivia? I saw her watching when I confronted Mark. Something felt off about it. Be careful, Mark had powerful connections. The desperation in Kyle's words was unmistakable. Carter clenched his jaw. He had warned Kyle about getting mixed up with people like Callahan. The art world was a cesspool of corruption, but Kyle, ever the optimist, thought he could navigate it without getting burned. There was no use dwelling on what could have been. It was time to act. Cracking his knuckles, Carter dove back into his research with renewed determination, combing through financial records, phone logs, social media, anything that might reveal the tangled web around Mark Callahan's life. Patterns began to emerge. Callahan's art dealings followed a predictable script. He would charm up incoming artists, seduce their spouses or partners, and then use that leverage to manipulate both the artist and the market, driving up prices and solidifying his influence. It was brutal, but Carter had to admit, it was clever. He dug deeper into Caroline's background. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but small inconsistencies began to surface: mysterious deposits in foreign accounts, frequent business trips that didn't quite add up. Carter's eyes narrowed. If Caroline was so deeply involved with Mark's schemes, why was she pointing the finger at Kyle? Unless... Carter sat up straight as a new theory started to form in his mind. What if Caroline was framing Kyle to protect herself? He needed to talk to her, but he had to be careful. If she was behind this, she was dangerous. A few well-placed questions might expose more than she intended. He picked up his phone and dialed Caroline's number. It was time to see just how far down this rabbit hole went. Caroline paced the living room, her anxiety growing by the minute. Everything was falling apart. Kyle was in custody, Mark was dead, and her carefully constructed life was crumbling around her. A sudden knock at the door startled her. She approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man she didn't recognize stood on her porch, casual but alert. "Mrs. Buford," he called through the door. "I'm Carter, a friend of Kyle's. I was hoping we could have a word." Caroline's heart pounded in her chest. One of Kyle's friends. This couldn't be good. But turning him away would only raise suspicion. She opened the door, forcing a polite, concerned smile. "Of course, come in. Any friend of Kyle's is welcome." Carter stepped inside, his eyes quickly scanning the room, taking in every detail. "Thank you, Mrs. Buford. I won't take up much of your time. I just have a few questions about the night Mark Callahan died." Caroline's smile faltered. "I've already spoken to the police. I'm not sure what else I could tell you." Carter's gaze was unyielding. Sometimes a different set of eyes can catch something new. "For example, I noticed some irregularities in your financial records over the last few months." Caroline felt the blood drain from her face. How did he know about that? Who exactly was this man? "I don't know what you're implying," she said stiffly, her voice strained. "But I think it's best if you leave now." Carter raised his hands in a calming gesture. "I didn't mean to upset you. I apologize. Just one more question, where were you between 9 p.m. and midnight on the night Mark died?" Caroline's thoughts raced. She had told the police she was home, but if this man knew about her finances, what else could he know? "I was out," she admitted, her voice tight. "Running errands. I needed to clear my head after everything that happened between Kyle and Mark." Carter nodded, as if considering her words. "I see. Well, thank you for your time, Mrs. Buford. I'm sure we'll be speaking again soon." As he left, Caroline leaned against the door, her mind spinning. This was bad. Really bad. She needed to act before her carefully crafted life unraveled completely. Meanwhile, Olivia Callahan stood by the window of her sprawling estate, gripping a glass of wine with trembling hands. Outside, police combed the grounds for any clues about her ex-husband's murder. Ex-husband, she corrected herself bitterly. The divorce papers had been sitting ready for weeks, just waiting to be signed. Now, she would never get the chance. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Mrs. Callahan, there's a man here to see you. He says he's a private investigator working for Kyle Buford." Olivia raised an eyebrow. Kyle Buford? The artist whose wife Mark had been having an affair with? This could get interesting. "Send him in," she said, straightening herself and putting on the face of a grieving widow. The man who walked in was unassuming in appearance, but his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm Carter. I've been hired to look into your husband's death on behalf of Kyle Buford." Olivia's lips twisted in a sneer. You mean the man accused of killing my husband? It's bold of him to send someone to question me. Carter's face remained neutral. Mr. Buford maintains his innocence. I'm simply trying to uncover the truth, wherever that may lead. I was hoping you might shed some light on Mark's business dealings. Olivia let out a cold, bitter laugh. Business dealings? Is that what we're calling it now? Mark's business was destroying lives and manipulating people. He was a monster. She saw the interest flicker in Carter's eyes and immediately regretted her words. She had said too much. That's an intriguing perspective, Mrs. Callahan. Would you care to elaborate? Olivia turned back to the window, her expression hardening. I think you should leave. I have a funeral to plan. But Carter wasn't done. He asked one final question. The security footage from the night of your husband's death shows a confrontation between the two of you. Can you explain what that was about? Olivia froze. How did he know about that? The footage should have been wiped clean. I have no idea what you're talking about, she said coldly. Now leave, or I'll have security escort you out. As Carter walked away, Olivia's mind raced. This was a disaster. If the footage had survived, she would need to act fast before her own secrets came to light. Little did she know, her past was about to come back and haunt her in ways she could never have imagined. The courtroom was packed as Kyle's lawyer presented the new evidence. Security footage revealed Olivia Callahan entering Mark's studio shortly after Kyle's confrontation. Financial records exposed a trail of embezzlement and fraud that Mark had been on the verge of uncovering, and the most incriminating piece, a pair of gloves found in Olivia's car with traces of the poison that killed Mark. The judge immediately ordered Kyle's release and reopened the investigation, leaving the courtroom buzzing with shock and disbelief. At the back of the room, Caroline went pale. This changed everything. With Kyle cleared, it wouldn't take long for suspicion to turn toward her involvement in Mark's dealings. She watched as Kyle was embraced by his supporters, his face a mix of relief and quiet determination. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded courtroom, and the coldness in his stare sent a chill down her spine. As the crowd stirred, Caroline slipped toward the exit, her mind racing. She needed to disappear before the delicate house of lies she had built came crashing down. But as she made her way to the door, a hand gripped her arm. Turning, she found herself face to face with Detective Gray. Leaving so soon, Mrs. Buford? I think you and I need to have another chat. Caroline's heart sank. Things were about to get much worse. Meanwhile, Carter's fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, his eyes locked on the screen. He had spent hours reviewing security footage from Mark's mansion, searching for anything that would prove Kyle's innocence. And now, he had found it. The grainy footage showed Olivia Callahan entering Mark's studio just after Kyle stormed out. Her posture was tense, and in her hand, she held something small, a vial. Leaning closer to the screen, Carter smirked. Gotcha, he muttered, picking up his phone and dialing Kyle's lawyer. I've got something you need to see. Olivia Callahan sat slumped in the interrogation room, her once impeccable appearance now disheveled. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, and her flawless makeup had long since smeared. She no longer resembled the polished socialite who once commanded the art world by Mark's side. Detective Gray entered the room, holding a thick file. Mrs. Callahan, we need to go over some new evidence. Olivia's eyes darted nervously. I've told you everything I know. Have you? Gray asked, laying out several photos across the table. Still shots from the security footage showing Olivia entering Mark's studio, a close-up of the vial in her hand. Care to explain this? Olivia's face went pale. I don't. Gray didn't miss a beat. We found traces of the poison used to kill your husband on a pair of gloves in your car. The same poison in the vial you're holding in these photos. Olivia's composure crumbled. You don't understand, she whispered, her voice trembling. Mark was a monster. You have no idea what he was capable of. So you killed him? Gray pressed. Olivia laughed bitterly, almost hysterically. I saw an opportunity, and I took it. That artist, Kyle. I saw him leave after their fight, and I knew Mark would be furious. Distracted. Vulnerable. She leaned in, her eyes wild with emotion. Do you know what it's like to be married to a man like that? Watching him ruin lives, manipulate people, all for his own gain. I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't let him hurt anyone else. Gray remained calm and expressionless. Olivia Callahan, you're under arrest for the murder of Mark Callahan. You have the right to remain silent. As Gray read her rights, Olivia slumped back in her chair, defeated. It was all over. Yet, in the midst of the chaos and the consequences, she felt something unexpected, relief. Kyle stood outside the courtroom, his expression hard as he watched Olivia being led away in handcuffs. It was over. He was free. A commotion down the hall caught his eye. Caroline was being escorted out by two officers, her face pale and drained of all color. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and in hers, Kyle saw fear, and something else. Regret. He turned away. Whatever Caroline felt now, it didn't matter. It was far too late. Carter appeared by Kyle's side. You good? Kyle nodded slowly. Yeah. I think I am. Thanks for everything, Carter. I owe you. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. Just glad we got to the truth. Kyle's jaw tightened, filled with new resolve. Now, I rebuild. And make sure nothing like this happens again in this corrupt business. The two men walked out of the courthouse together, Kyle's mind already racing with plans. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in months, he felt a spark of hope. The divorce had been swift. With Kyle's lawyer presenting clear evidence of Caroline's affair and her attempt to frame him for Mark's murder, the judge's ruling came quickly and decisively. As Kyle signed the final papers, he felt a heavy weight lift from his shoulders. It was finally over. He was free. But his work wasn't done, not by a long shot. Back in his studio, Kyle stood before a blank canvas, his fingers itching to create. He needed to channel all the pain and betrayal of the past months into something meaningful, something both beautiful and dark. Picking up a thin glass rod, the familiar weight in his hand steadied him as he began molding the molten glass. Slowly, a new series began to take shape, one he would call Reflections of Betrayal, a chronicle of lies, manipulation, and ultimately, redemption. Each piece would tell a part of the story, trust shattered like delicate glass, lies spun as intricately and dangerously as a spider's web, and finally, the phoenix rising from the ashes, stronger and more radiant than before. Kyle poured every ounce of his emotions into his work, losing himself in the process as days blurred into weeks. As the series took life, word began to spread. Soon, the art world buzzed with rumors of Kyle Buford's dramatic return and comeback. Gallery owners competed for the chance to showcase his new work, and critics penned glowing previews, eager to witness his latest creations firsthand. But Kyle wasn't distracted by the noise. His focus remained sharp, his goal crystal clear. On the night of the gallery opening, Kyle stood before the crowd, his heart racing. This was the moment. The culmination of everything he had worked for. He cleared his throat, and the room grew silent. Thank you all for being here tonight, he began. This series, Reflections of Betrayal, is more than just art, it's a story. My story. And the story of countless others who've been deceived and betrayed by the very people they trusted most. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Kyle continued. For too long, the art world has been a breeding ground for corruption and deceit. We've allowed the Mark Callahans of the world to exploit artists for their own gain. Well, I'm here to say, no more. He gestured to the sculptures surrounding him, each one a masterpiece of delicate, intricate glasswork. Each of these pieces represents a chapter in my journey, from blind trust to bitter betrayal, to finally, redemption. But more than that, they stand for something bigger, a call to action. Kyle's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. It's time for us to reclaim our industry. To demand transparency and integrity. To protect young artists from predators who seek to take advantage of them. He noticed a few uneasy shifts in the audience, and he welcomed the discomfort. Let them feel it. Change always started with discomfort. I stand before you today not just as an artist, but as someone who survived betrayal and come out the other side. And now, I'm asking all of you to join me in building a better, more honest art world, one where talent and integrity are the things that matter most. As Kyle finished speaking, the room burst into applause. He saw tears glistening in a few eyes and a look of fierce determination in others. In the back of the room, partially obscured by a pillar, Kyle spotted a familiar face, Caroline. Her expression was unreadable as she observed him from a distance. Kyle turned away. He had spoken his truth. Now, it was time for his art to speak on its own. The months that followed were a blur of activity. Reflections of Betrayal became the talk of the art world, celebrated for its raw emotional honesty and technical mastery. Kyle was flooded with invitations to galleries and exhibitions around the globe. His name was everywhere, his story held up as an inspiration for artists across the industry. But it wasn't just personal success that came out of this. Kyle's call for change had struck a deep chord. Messages began pouring in from fellow artists who had their own stories of exploitation and manipulation. This sparked an idea, one that could make a real impact. Kyle reached out to his contacts in the industry and proposed a mentorship program for young artists, a way to guide them through the challenges of the art world, teaching them how to protect both themselves and their work. The response was overwhelming. Artists, gallery owners, and even a few reformed Mark Callahan types eagerly joined the cause. Within months, the program was up and running. Kyle threw himself into it with the same dedication he gave to his art. He organized workshops, created apprenticeships, and provided a listening ear to those who needed guidance. For the first time in years, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment, not just as an artist, but as a human being. Exactly 1 year after the gallery opening that had changed his life, Kyle stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd gathered for the mentorship program's first annual gala. So much had changed. The art world was evolving, greater transparency in deals, stricter ethical standards, and a growing network of support for artists facing challenges. There was still plenty of work ahead, but progress was being made. Kyle cleared his throat, ready to start his speech, when movement near the entrance caught his attention. Standing there was Caroline, looking small and unsure. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Kyle felt a flicker of the old anger and hurt. But then, nothing. He realized, with quiet satisfaction, that she no longer had any hold over him. Turning back to the podium, he focused on the eager faces in front of him, the future of the art world, and his own future. "Good evening, everyone," he began. "Thank you for being here tonight. We've come a long way in the past year, but the road ahead is still full of challenges." As he spoke about resilience, integrity, and the power of community, Kyle felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He had faced his demons and come out stronger. Now, he had the chance to help others do the same. The past was behind him, and the future ahead was bright and full of promise.